Hello, everybody, and welcome to Forever Sports. Could we see the South African teams leaving the EPCR Challenge and Champions Cup? A story coming out today saying that SARU is strongly considering the possibility of withdrawing from the European competitions due to player welfare, with no global calendar having been reached after 14 years worth of discussions. SA Rugby and Mark Alexander have confirmed that big decisions will be taking place in July, where SA Rugby will basically plot the future of the South African rugby team's involvement in various competitions and ensure that they can kind of find a calendar that suits the welfare of their players. Because basically at the moment, the major issue is that our South African placed players play in a URC, an EPCR Champions Cup, and they play a lot of rugby between sort of September and June, and then go straight into a rugby championship. They still at Currie Cup, for example, the likes of that, and there's just no window for rest for South African-based players. And as a result, one of the extreme options to try and fix this is to pull out of the EPCR Challenge and Champions Cup. Before we get into it, please do smash a like on the video. Please do subscribe to the channel as well. Right, so article coming out today in The Times saying that basically the calendar is not sustainable for player welfare, and as a result are looking at all options and could abandon the Champions Cup, which is very annoying as a Lions fan because we're about to make it into the Champions Cup, although this would not affect next season. So basically they're saying they are considering pulling out of the Investor Champions Cup with a formal decision to be made in July. It is a move that largely stems from player welfare and saying that it's basically unsustainable for their top players to compete in the Northern Hemisphere club season and Southern Hemisphere test matches, leaving little room for rest. We will hold talks in the coming months before deciding which competitions we can drop. Any moving away from your competitions will also include clubs dropping out of the second tier Challenge Cup. So let's also go to the article, then we'll kind of talk about the merit, shall we? And this says we generate, this is a quote from Mark Alexander saying, "We generate our income from participating in tournaments. Participation is important, but our players are overworked." He says, "We will hold a workshop in July in which we will have to decide which competitions will be retained and which ones we can drop." And a source said that there's definitely a wavering from SA Rugby on the Champions Cup, feeling that that potentially could be an excess competition that they don't necessarily need. It would be huge because being a member, and this is what this mentions, being a member of the URC means we're an automatic shareholder in the EPCR, which means that we hold shares in the EPCR competitions, and so we can't just withdraw really. It obviously wouldn't take place next year. Next year will continue as per usual, but the question would then be what happens afterwards. There's also massive ramifications as well with regards to the Club World Cup, which is supposed to take place in 2028. And if we basically pull out the EPCR, what would happen then? Because then we're not playing in an intercontinental competition like the EPCR Champions Cup. We'll just be in the URC. And their plan, I think, was to use the Champions and Challenge Cup to basically use it as qualification and seeding, for example, for the Club World Cup. Now the talk is basically they would look at focusing and expanding the domestic Currie Cup competition. I think the realization over here, and I think maybe this is a bit of a stronghold from SA Rugby, is that the EPCR competitions are fundamentally wrong at the moment. The format is wrong. I still believe it can exist. I still believe the South African teams can be involved, but I think that the format needs to have a complete relook. And I think we can get into a situation where you basically have 3 pool games. You can go straight into a quarterfinal, semifinals, final situation. And basically, if you were to get to the final of the EPCR, it's an additional like 6 matches a season, which I think at the moment is about 8 to 9 matches a season. So you could reduce it, I personally think, by a good 20-30%. Because again, it has massive ramifications. It's not as simple as just saying, "Oh, we just won't play in it." It's not that simple. We are shareholders in these competitions. Virtue of being in the URC means you kind of almost need to be in the EPCR. And I'm not sure we'll be able to be in the URC and not have that, for example. I also think from a South African fan point of view, we look at the Champions Cup. Well, that is the trophy right now. That's the biggest trophy we can currently win. The URC trophy, will we hold it in as high a stead, for example? Is that as big of an honor? Can we revive the Currie Cup to become something that is genuinely really, really sought after? I think by the players, it's still a massive thing to win the Currie Cup. But like young fans, for example, they don't see the value really. I don't think they see what the Currie Cup is. We get very nostalgic about it, and I grew up watching the Currie Cup, and you wanted to win the Currie Cup and the likes of that. But even when I grew up, the Currie Cup was always seen as a smaller competition compared to a Super Rugby, for example. And I think that's obviously still the case. You kind of now have your EPCR, your URC, and then your sort of Currie Cup. So it would be very difficult, I believe, to start trying to make it seem as if that is a competition that we can hold in higher stead than an EPCR. But maybe they can. Maybe this is the birth of a new Currie Cup system. But obviously, things a lot a lot going on. And one of the big things that they've said is SA Rugby are pushing to move the Rugby Championship into the same window as the Six Nations. That would actually then allow us to continue being in the sort of the Champions Cup and the Challenge Cup, because it would then mean that, and we play the same. It's one more additional game, to be honest. I mean, the Six Nations are 5 games, 5 game weeks. The Rugby Championship is 6 game weeks because you play every twice. So that is the logical step, really, is to try and bring that alignment in. That would solve the global calendar. The issue comes in inverted commas that now it's during Super Rugby, but the same thing is kind of during the URC. Obviously, it's slightly different from a weather point of view, but I still believe that is a possibility that can happen. And I think the big push at the moment is really Super Rugby, which is kind of refusing it. And it's not as simple. You know, they've got to look at weather and time of the year. But if Super Rugby were to, for example, fall into alignment with your URC and they were to start kind of in your September, October, we could create a global calendar. We could basically have your domestic competitions running, and that's what World Football have. FIFA have a global calendar, essentially. Some of the leagues are slightly different, but your general, I mean, for example, your South African league runs exactly the same time as a Premier League, for example, overseas, and all the European leagues and some of the Korean leagues and the likes of that, so that you can basically have test windows and international windows like we have, and it's no clubs are playing. And that's the problem, is we have international test windows during a time when there is club rugby, and that's where we need to talk about a global calendar. So, for example, if Super Rugby were to start in September, October, we could have club rugby in October, international rugby in November, club rugby January, in December, January, and February. We can have 2 weeks windows for your international rugby championship at the same time, and then come the end of June, we basically finish with our club competitions, all competitions. You know, Super Rugby could still run until June, because they just shifted a bit earlier, and then come July, we have a month of internationals, and then no rugby basically for August. And in September, suddenly we're back into a bit of preseason, and off we go again. But we don't have a rugby championship, and players can have full preseasons and get going. That is the solution to all of this, but that's not happening. And as a result, SA Rugby are now having to look at it and say, what can we cut? And I'll be sad to leave the Champions Cup, because I think it was a competition we're starting to get kind of the gist of. We're starting to understand the kind of depth. We're trying to build the kind of depth to be able to compete in the likes of the Champions Cup and the Challenge Cup. What are your thoughts? Should we stay? Should we go? Let me know down in the comments below. Smash a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Steve, and I'll chat to you soon.